You're ridiculous. Michael, you actually think a machine will make you into something other than boring, Laura said, loud enough that the woman at the craps table turned. Two men in suits snorted, and my daughter Emma glanced up from her coloring book with the kind of slow, careful disappointment that lands harder than anger. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 43, from Akron, Ohio, and I felt the whole room contract into the shape of that single sentence. I felt the blood in my ears, the cheap carpet under my shoes, the brass coin in my palm like a confession. I had the coin because my father pressed it into my hand on the morning I left for college. A thumb-worn brass thing, an anemic metal with a scratch that looked like a child's initial. I used it because I liked the weight of old metals in new places, because I kept small talismans for private luck, because there was a quiet ledger I kept that nobody knew about, and that ledger remembers what careful men do. Wait until the world forgets to be fair, and then collect what it's owed. Lavra laughed and called me a fool, and the dealer pretended not to notice, but the man at the roulette wheel and the cocktail waitress both turned their heads, and Emma pushed her crayons aside and said nothing, which is worse, and the bright logos of the casino shimmered like an accusation. I lifted the coin like a benediction and fed it into the slot because I wanted, for once, to not make a spectacle of myself by failing loudly. The machine hummed. The lights blinked in the stupid Morse of possibility, and the reels slid like lungs exhaling. I watched the icons line up, watched the cherry trip free and the bar slide into place, watched the whole ridiculous screen shutter and then explode into a cascade of sound and light that made my throat raw. People cheered because that's how strangers behave when the world hands them a show, and Laura's smile was a small, practiced pucker of disdain as she turned to someone new, a man with an expensive shave and the predatory confidence of someone who knows how to finish a sentence with someone else's name. Jason Miller introduced himself. The way he said Emma's name like a promise made my stomach drop. I wanted to reach for Emma and say, "Hold my hand. I'm the man who changes tires in the rain. I'm the one who keeps receipts and shows up at PTA. I'm the one who sweeps the porch even when the leaves don't seem to need it." But I felt hollowed out by the show of my own success because Laura's face folded into mockery, and she said into my ear, "Even if you win, you'll probably find a way to lose it," and walked away. Arm looped through Jason's, leaving me in the bright laughing maw of the casino while Emma watched with the slow disbelief of someone being taught to choose shame as a lesson. The brass coin was hot in my hand. I could have thrown it into a fountain, swallowed it, announced the win to applause and tears and the little cameras that blurt marketing slogans into the ceiling. Instead, I cashed out quietly, took the envelope that smelled faintly of money and dust, and slid it into the inner flap of my jacket where the ledger lived in digital silence on an old thumb drive I kept taped to the lining. I did not shout. I did not chase. I told myself I would protect the small world Emma deserved, and that meant shutting my mouth and thinking farther than the next hour, because humiliation delivered in public begets desperate, petty responses that ruin more than one life. I watched Laura as she vanished into the crowd with Jason like a page torn from a life I'd written carefully and folded under a magnet on the fridge. Men at the bar clinked bottles and lifted their jaws at the spectacle. The casino speakers spilled a pop song about winning, and I walked out into the humid neon night carrying a heavy secret and a lighter weight of future planning than I had brought into the place. People say humiliation is quick like a slap. The truth is, it lingers like smoke in the hair. I stood on the sidewalk, Emma's small hand in mine, and I allowed one clean, hot, honest thing to travel through me. I would not let her see me break. A man can be steady like a ledger and still burn like lightning, I thought, and the thought was private enough to be dangerous. The first thing I did was sign the papers to consult a lawyer named Vanessa Hawley, who smelled of mint and old books and spoke with the surgical economy of someone who had seen marriages crumble into spreadsheets. The second thing I did was record everything I thought I could need: voices, names, the time Jason's hand rested on Laura's back like a claim. The third thing I did, and this is the ledger I promised myself I would keep, was move money into accounts in places no one would look until I wanted them to look. Not because I wanted to hoard. Because I wanted options, and options are the only honest revenge I could imagine that didn't cross into the petty destructiveness of a man who reacts out of spite. I drove through the night with Emma sleeping on the back seat, her hair smelling like the cheap shampoo from the hotel. The brass coin pressed against my palm, the whole drive like a heart I had not yet admitted belonged to me, and I swore not to tell Emma about the win, not to let her think money could buy dignity. I only wanted it to buy us a chance to breathe somewhere that wasn't loud enough to remember Laura's words. The first money I used paid for a thin office and a meeting with Vanessa and Marcus Fields, a private investigator with a limp and a conscience built of coffee and courthouse corridors, and I asked them to find patterns, creditors, ledgers, a trail of things Laura might have taken for granted. I wanted evidence, not spectacle. I wanted to build slowly, like winter setting ice on a pond, because I had watched people who reacted quick and loud burn everything valuable in a moment. You don't get to shame the man who learns the power of patience, settled like a taste in my mouth, and I turned the brass coin in my pocket that night like a rosary. The world moved on outside that little office as if nothing had happened. Slot machines triaged people's grief into jingles and jingles into compulsion, and I learned to measure my breath between one calculated step and the next. That was how things started, with a public insult, a child's quiet face, a brass coin that meant more than luck, and a ledger I kept so faithfully it became a weapon of sorts because knowledge, when amassed, refuses to be harmless. I left town quietly the week the divorce papers hit Laura's inbox. Emma and I moved into a small rental with a view of the highway where trucks looked like programmed beasts cutting ancient lines, and I met people who did not know my hometown and therefore did not expect my loyalty to be performative. I started drinking coffee in diners at dawn, the ones that keep the same syrup bottle on the counter for decades and have waitresses who call everyone hun, and I kept the ledger like a priest holds the ritual book, making entries that smelled of numbers and patience. I enrolled Emma in a school with a counselor named Rebecca, who paid attention to small silences and trusted me to tell her the shape of my fear, and that steady, quiet life became the soil for something that was not sudden. Investments, small and steady, that grew like stubborn grass through concrete. There was a stretch of months where my identity shrank to three things: parent, ledger keeper, and man who refused to be spectacle, and in that smallness I felt power grow. I worked overtime at the tech firm I had helped build. I stopped taking lunches with men who drank too loudly to cover up their emptiness, and I taught myself to be ruthless in the way a surgeon is ruthless. Not violent, but precise. At night I read legal briefs and investment strategies, learned about irrevocable trusts and the way courts treat marital assets when introduced with evidence of infidelity. And every time the phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, I braced, because I knew how humiliation breeds vultures. Vanessa was efficient. She drew maps of liability and ownership with the calm cruelty of someone who has seen castles fall because of a leaking roof. Marcus found credit card statements in places Laura had believed were private, and the names of numbers that answered with soft voices and late hours. The ledger grew until it looked like an atlas of leverage. I did not gloat when small victories appeared. I logged them and kept moving. I also kept an eye on Laura from distance because there is a kind of accountability in seeing the person who wronged you be human and fragile. She went to parties less and to bars more. The glitter on her social media began to rust into grainy photos and tags with men whose reputations matched their necklines. There were emails that suggested she had borrowed against things she did not own, and texts that read like confessions. I could have called her, could have tried to salvage what remained by offering anything that wasn't a humiliation backward. Instead, I chose to be faithful to the ledger. Evidence first, option second, dignity third. I hired accountants to untangle joint accounts and to move assets into childhood trusts for Emma's future. Trusts that were structured to protect her from the kind of gravity that brings people down. I am not proud of all I did. I am proud of being deliberate. The more I worked, the more I realized that the world rewards people who compound effort and punish people who think performance is the same as substance. I watched Laura spiral on social channels and in sober glimpses when mutual acquaintances pitifully offered updates. And every time I felt a fresh flare of wanting to do something dramatic, I put my hand over my mouth and reminded myself of the ledger's law. Measured, legal, unflinching. Justice is quiet until it is not. Build the machine and it will run. I would tell myself in low hours and feel less like a vengeful man and more like a workman finishing a job. My days began to blend in a way that felt necessary: conference calls, school pickups, lawyer meetings, signing documents that read like faintly ominous spells. But the ledger was the constant that returned to me like sleep. I never flaunted the win in public. In fact, I removed the casino's cheery symbol from my life like a small funeral. No parties, no interviews, no bragging. I allowed the money to be practical while my actions were surgical. We moved from motel rooms to apartments to a small condo where the elevators smelled of disinfectant and ambition. Emma's hair lengthened and she took to drawing pictures of houses with tall windows. When people asked about Laura, I replied with a neutral voice and no request for pity. Protect and nurture, I told myself, not parade. At night, long after Emma slept, I would press the brass coin between my fingers and rehearse the moves that had to be made. Notifications to banks, timed filings, the way a judge reads a file and sees a pattern. The trap I was setting was not a snapping wire but a patient legal architecture. It would take time, it would take precise steps. And it would be, I hoped, irreversible. Marcus found a thread and tugged, and when he tugged more came. Late-night receipts, messages about vacations funded by credit cards that had been maxed out and transferred between cities. A voicemail in which Laura laughed in a voice that was not ours when she had our daughter's name on her lips. Vanessa arranged filings like a chess player aligning pieces, and I watched their hands work with the cool attention of someone arranging a stage because the show must be believable when the curtain rises. We served divorce papers with anecdotal care. We put in affidavits that charted Laura's abandonment, her wandering away in a moment when we needed her stable, and we made sure Emma's needs were ringed with legal fences so that no creditor could take what was meant for her. The prenup Vanessa dug up, a document I'd signed years before as a practical protection, had a clause we had both laughed at once, a clause that said morning of ceremony adjustments for clear acts of infidelity would alter support in ways the law respects if proven, and Marcus had the proof. Video of Laura leaving the casino with Jason, receipts for hotel rooms neither of us would have expected. Witness statements from people who had seen them together laughing while the child clung to the corner of a chair. He had photos, peripheral and grainy, but enough. In court 10 days later, Judge Robert Stanton did not make a spectacle. He examined ink and timestamps and found the evidence credible. Laura's face in the courtroom was not triumphant but raw. She slept less often, looked older, and the hydration masks the tabloids brandished did little to cover the fatigue. The judge parsed the prenup with a steady hand and awarded custody arrangements, divided assets in a way that protected Emma, and enforced the clause in a manner that meant Laura would not receive the kind of windfall she might have expected if the marriage had been judged innocent of the allegations. The legal machine moved in slow, implacable steps that felt like cold justice, and when the decree was filed, I felt only a strange, searing emptiness, a space where I had expected catharsis. I had wanted justice, yes, but there is a different kind of victory when you see your child safe and your pockets and investments untouched by someone else's recklessness. The brass coin in my palm seemed suddenly small against the ledger's broad sweep, but I kept it, folded inside a velvet box I could not bring myself to throw away. Money can't unteach you how to be small, I thought once, and the thought kept me from rejoicing too loudly. The months after the court's decision were a mix of stability and news of Laura unraveling. A car repossessed by a neighbor who had co-signed a loan, a late-night photo of her slumped in a bar booth, a voicemail from a woman who said she'd seen Laura begging for a ride home and smelling of vomit. I did not gloat. It is not a clean pleasure to see someone you once loved dissolve. But I also did not pretend the ledger's work was not a kind of moral arithmetic that balances ledgers against lives. I traveled once just to wake up somewhere that didn't speak my name. Stayed in hotels with elevators that sang and views that made my throat thin, and in those small airplane nights, I allowed myself to think about the future in terms of maps instead of wounds. I bought a penthouse in a city that smelled of salt and diesel and the tang of markets. I walked its terrace and imagined a life where Emma could be who she wanted to be without the soundtrack of that casino hum. I sent Emma to summer camps where boys and girls wore name tags and learned to build sailboats out of balsa wood. She learned to swim and did not, for a long time, ask about her mother. That quiet became both blessing and punishment. To win and then find the victory is not a climax but another work to be done. I kept the brass coin because habits keep histories and because, somewhere inside me, I wanted to remember the exact second when everything changed. It became a totem I carried when I needed to remind myself of the man who chose measured action over spectacle. Marcus occasionally came by with new information that made my jaw set. Vanessa advised like a matron of war. Rebecca, Emma's counselor, taught me how to listen when the child did not want to speak. Each piece of the plan tightened a loop not by cruelty, but by the exactness of law and the economy of prudence. I did not want to watch Laura crash. I wanted to remove her from the safety nets she'd assumed were infinite. That is not noble. It is necessary if the person who mocked your dignity in front of your child insists that there are no consequences to their cruelty. The ledger, in that way, is an instrument of safety and also, quietly, a hammer. The day the final papers were signed, I did something small and theatrical because I had learned that symbolism can be a precise strike when the law has done the heavy lifting. I took the brass coin to the little diner near where Emma and I had first learned to be less grandiose and more useful to one another, and I left it on the counter wrapped in a napkin beside a receipt that read, "Paid in full." The owner, an old man named Gus, who still hung a neon sign that said, "Open even" when customers were few, smiled a smile that knew storms, and I watched the coin glint in the fluorescent light as if it had the last laugh. I did not announce to anyone that I had used the prenup clause to protect Emma and remove the possibility of Laura siphoning off a fortune to feed her new lifestyle. I let the legal papers do that quietly. Some nights the guilt pressed into my ribs like a physical thing, and I woke with the taste of iron and the phrase Laura had spoken in my ear like a rasp. "You'll lose it," and I felt the ledger's quiet answer in my hand. There is a difference between revenge and correction. My actions were not designed to humiliate, but to prevent future harm, and to ensure that the child we shared would not be raised in a net of drama and financial instability. That distinction does not keep me from thinking of Lara when she appears in late-night videos on social media, her face sometimes softened by filters, sometimes raw. Sometimes she reaches out to people who write her with promises of help, and sometimes she refuses it. I do not seek to watch her fail. I cannot pretend there is joy in that. But I also cannot pretend she did not choose, in the casino parking lot, in the cheap hotel lobby under the hum of a microwave, in that half-second when she decided to mock my dignity in front of our child. Actions have consequences, and time will be the accountant. Marcus reported a foreclosure notice posted at one of her addresses. Someone else texted me a clip of her stealing from a boutique, and in the margins of the ledger I wrote down dates and numbers because the habit of recording calmed me. The final move, the one that tightened the noose so that she could no longer rebuild in the ways she once had, was a quiet corporate maneuver Vanessa orchestrated. We had quietly purchased, through a chain of trusts and silent bids, a small portfolio of properties and consumer interests that intersected with the networks that had propped Lara up for years. Lines of credit, small-time loans, the kind of things that feed a person who confuses freedom with spending. The contracts were legal and precise. They did not name Lara directly, but the result was the same. The credit lines she had used vanished. The vendors who once extended her goods on faith stopped, and suddenly the safety net she had always assumed was there tore, and she fell. The brass coin was both a memory and a symbol. The ledger had become a set of tools designed to protect what mattered to me. The day I mailed a small envelope with that coin inside back to an address I knew she used was not a moment of gloating but a quiet punctuation. I wrote a note that said simply, "This was luck once. Build something that takes work." I cannot say whether she read it or tossed it in the bottom of a bag along with other mementos. I do know the coin arrived, and the next headline I saw had her name beside a word that tastes like vinegar: addiction. I felt nothing at first. Only the dull, hard affirmation that the ledger had worked as designed, and then a slow, complicated ache. The press did nothing but amplify. Once you are a story people love to watch fall, the world will show you every stage of that fall and call it entertainment. There was a moment in that crash of media and pity and avoidance where I thought of chasing her into the press room and handing back every cent and asking for forgiveness. I thought of Emma and the quiet way she arranged her blocks, and how the letters she wrote looked like attempts to map a world she didn't understand. But I did not undo the work. I merely continued to do what the ledger asked of me: protect, arrange, secure. In the quiet that followed, I traveled, sat on terraces, paid for schools, hired tutors, and let the brass coin rest in a velvet box on a shelf like a relic from a life lesson. The man who had once been publicly shamed in front of his daughter now had means to create a life that protected her from such shaming. It is not a balm for what happened, only a fence around the future. The final act was not a spectacle in the way tabloids promise one, but it felt like a closing note. Lavra, in a series of small errors and abandoned pleas for help, found herself with no credit, no apartment, and a network of people who had been burned by her choices. Jason receded. The men who had been bright around her were indifferent when their kindness required labor. She checked into a short-term program that declared her eligible for assistance only under strict conditions, And when she failed to meet them, the shelter lists flagged her, and the interventions evaporated. I watched from a distance because intimacy would have compromised everything, because there is a cruel satisfaction in seeing justice as a thing of laws and trusts, and not as personal vengeance. I also watched with a soft terror because being the man who engineered someone's ruin is a job that leaves scars. On a rainy afternoon, I flew back to Akron to collect Emma for a holiday. She ran into Grandma's arms, and I watched them like a man who has been given a second script, and from the car I saw a woman at the end of a block, smaller than the photographs, a silhouette with a paper cup in her hands. For a while I thought of stepping out, extending something, and then I remembered the night in the casino when she had used my humiliation for a spectacle, and left a child with a choice between two scripts, one written in small acts of consistency, the other in bright, instant escapes. I drove by without stopping. The brass coin I had once fed into a machine, the coin that had been a talisman and a totem, felt like an old prayer at my throat. Months later, the coin would sit, unexpectedly, on the table at a fundraiser for a community program I helped found, an anonymous donation in the name of Akron's Kids. And a photo of the coin next to a check would circulate among people who knew Lavra. Someone would take the picture and send it to her with a note. "You asked what he would do with his luck. I didn't orchestrate that particular exposure." Sometimes the world arranges symbols better than we do. What I had orchestrated was the protection of my daughter and the assurance that my life would not be the stage for other people's theater. Walking away from the courtroom, the diner, the trucks on the highway, the nights of planning, I felt both hollow and oddly whole. The ledger had given me a life. It had also taken what was necessary to keep that life intact. I do not pretend the result is clean or the loss uncomplicated. Laura's downfall pings at the corners of everything I built, but I also cannot deny what I learned. Prudence, applied with calm, becomes its own kind of power. 2 sentences. Do the work quietly and protect what matters. There is no dignity in spectacle, only in the steady hands that keep a child warm. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.